Assalamu alaikum everyone. This is your host Jamshed Namdar Khan with another episode of the Book Review Now. In this episode, we will explore an outstanding and magnificent book entitled The Impossible State, Islam, Politics and Modernity's Moral Predicament by Wael B. Hallaq. This book was originally published in 2013 in New York by the Columbia University Press. The profound and extraordinary conclusion of Hallaq's book, The Impossible State, Islam, Politics and Modernity's Moral Predicament is that the world is headed towards a major catastrophic disaster and the solution to save the world is Islam. Both the Islamic civilization and the European civilization are in deep turmoil and headed towards self-destruction. The Islamic civilization is a disaster because it has abandoned its 1200 years old morally based and God-based sovereignty concept of governance. The Euro-American civilization is a disaster because they have erected a sand castle which is not based on any moral authority. Both the Islamic world and the European American world, and by extension the entire world, can be saved only if both civilizations revert back to moral principles. The great teachings of Islam are the only solution that can save both the Islamic world and also the Euro-American Western world. Wael B. Hallaq is a scholar of Islamic law and Islamic intellectual history. He is currently the Avalon Foundation Professor in the Humanities at Columbia University at the Department of Middle Eastern, South Asian, and African Studies. After a PhD from the University of Washington, he joined the McGill University Institute of Islamic Studies in 1985 to become an assistant professor in Islamic law. In 1994, he earned full professorship and in 2005 became a James McGill Professor in Islamic law. Hallaq is a prolific author and lecturer. He is a world-renowned scholar of Islam with numerous contributions to the field of Islamic legal studies. His many books include The Impossible State, Islam, Politics and Modernity's Moral Predicament, Restating Orientalism, A Critique of Modern Knowledge, Sharia, Theory, Practice and Transformations, Reforming Modernity, Ethics and New Human in the Philosophy of Abdur Rahman Taha, An Introduction to Islamic Law, A History of Islamic Legal Theories and Introduction to Sunni Usul al-Fiqh, amongst others. His work has been translated into several languages including Arabic, Hebrew, Indonesian, Italian, Japanese, Korean, Persian and Turkish. In 2009, and despite his non-Muslim background, Hallaq was named amongst the 500 most influential Muslims in the world. His recent work explores the paradigmatic structures of Islamic political and ethical thought, which he uses as a foundation for a thorough critique of modern ethical and political paradigms that, he argues, are dominant since the Enlightenment. The author Wael B. Hallaq, in this very seminal, extraordinary and magnificent book, compares and contrasts two paradigmatic, hegemonic and worldwide civilizations. The two civilizations that are the object of this study are the pre-modern Islamic civilization and the Enlightenment or Renaissance Western civilization. According to the author, these two civilizations are not only diametrically different from each other, but in fact may quite significantly be opposed to each other's worldviews. Thus, this book is about morality, law, ethics, and society as it relates to both the old Islamic civilization and the modern Western European civilization, and what the future holds for both these civilizations and their impacts on the world at large. The main thesis of the book is that it is absolutely impossible to have an Islamic state. In fact, an Islamic state is a contradiction in terms because if there is a state, then by definition it is un-Islamic. And if there is an Islamic polity or an Islamic government or an Islamic governance over some area, then by definition it cannot be classified as a state. This is because the Islamic governance was founded on the synthesis and unity of revelation and the legal, whereas the Western state concept of the post-Renaissance period is based on the divorce of revelation and the legal. Thus the complete and total incompatibility between the Islamic model of governance and the Western concept of governance. Furthermore, there is a dramatic moral dilemma facing the Western civilization as the root bases on which it is founded are basically and distinctly immoral. The immorality of the West springs from the Western rejection of religion and revelation as a foundational basis for any system of knowledge and governance. The conclusion of the book is that Islam offers a solution for both of these civilizations. On the one hand, Muslim people, if they go back to their governance roots based on morality and Sharia, can probably salvage their destiny and can become once again a beacon of light for the whole world. On the other hand, if the Western Euro-American civilization learns from the moral teachings that the Muslim world and the moral lessons that Sharia offers, the Western civilization may be able to avoid their ultimate civilizational disaster and suicide. This is because the concept of a state is a very recent European creation. The theory of the nation-state was developed by the Europeans in the middle of the 17th century. Then, at the beginning of the 19th century, when the European colonial experiment was at its pinnacle, the Islamic domains that had once been governed and regulated by the Sharia, defined here as Islamic law, were systematically, structurally dismantled by the Europeans. The Sharia code that had once flourished in the Islamic world was the cornerstone of the socio-economic and political stability of this world. This Sharia was deliberately and systematically reduced by the Europeans to reflect no more than a legislation for personal status, inheritance laws, divorce laws, and family relations. It would not be far-flung or wrong to say that a vast majority of Muslims thirst and yearn for the Sharia to return to their countries. The majority of Muslim people, including their intellectuals, have come to assume that the concept of a modern state is the norm and a self-evident reality. The Muslims assume that the nation-states have always existed over their long and glorious history, and that this concept of a state is sanctioned by no less than the Holy Quran itself. However, there is an internal contradiction here which the Muslims are trying very hard to reconcile. This contradiction is one of non-compatibility of the state and the Sharia. As mentioned before, if there is a state, there can be no Sharia, and if there is a Sharia, there can be no state. This is an irreconcilable contradiction. Despite this non-bridgeable contradiction between the state and the Sharia, the concept of the state remains as a favorite template amongst the Muslim people. The author makes it quite clear from the outset that in this book he is absolutely not advocating that there is no place for Islamic law or Islamic governance in this world. Instead, the author in fact is proposing a creative reformulation of the Sharia and the Islamic governance such that the Muslim world in particular and the world in general benefits in the future. Unless the Muslims diagnose and come to grips with the multi-layered contradictions entailed in the concept of the Islamic State, the future reconstruction and flourishing of the Muslim world would be next to impossible. The author elaborates in this book that the contradiction that the Muslim people face in the term Islamic State is primarily due to modernity's moral predicament. It must be emphasized that by modernity, Hallaq does not mean a linear chronological timeline to the present contemporaneous day. Modernity means the norms, values, and governing principles of the state as enshrined within the Western civilization since the Age of Enlightenment. This is the period that we can safely and approximately take from 1650 to 1950 CE. The political and the economic difficulties that the Muslim world face today are rooted in modernity's moral dilemma. What is this moral dilemma? The West's moral dilemma is based on the fact that the Europeans have abandoned revelation or morality and based their strength and development on reason alone, whereas the Muslim governance was based on the unity and synthesis of revelation and reason. The West's enlightenment and state concept is based on the divorce or separation of reason and morality. Thus, if these contradictions that the Muslim face can somehow be amicably resolved on the basis of morality and revelation, this will then automatically solve the political and economic problems that the Muslim face today. Thus, the primary thrust of Hallaq's book is on moral thought and less on politics or the law. Hallaq elaborates his thesis by first discussing what the paradigmatic Islamic governance and what the paradigmatic modern state entail. He then discusses the ideas of sovereign will and the rule of law. The constitutional differences between the two systems of governance are then highlighted. The author then narrows the focus from the macroscopic systems of thoughts and politics to the microscopic individual level. The author then argues that even if against all the formidable odds arrayed against the Islamic governance, that if an Islamic governance does come into existence, the modern forms of globalization will render it completely ineffective and impossible. Based on all the aggregate arguments presented in this book and the current prevailing political conditions in the world today, the author feels that any form of Islamic governance is unsustainable and almost impossible. Finally, the author concludes by discussing the ideas of paradigms and central domains and interrogates the root causes of modernity's moral dilemmas. The author discusses that if the Islamic governance cannot be achieved because of the lack of an auspicious moral environment, then this failure must be connected with the difficulties that modernity's moral dilemmas have created. The author then connects the impossibility of the Islamic State with other problems that modernity's moral failures have created. These failures include the collapse of the family unit, oppressive economic world order, and the destruction of the natural habitats and the environment. These failures are not only physical and material failures, but more importantly, the author considers all these failures to be philosophical and moral failures. The author, in passing, does see a ray of hope in the internal moral critique within Western postmodernity, where there is a convergence of view between the two for the modern Muslim call for the establishment of Islamic governance. Hallaq claims that a modern Islamic state is impossible and even a contradiction in terms. The main thesis of the book is that there can be no such thing as an Islamic state. The Islamic state is an impossibility, and hence the title of the book, The Impossible State. This is because the Islamic form of government, which ruled the world for over 1200 years, was based on the law called the Sharia. This Muslim law was a synthesis of morality, revelation, and reason. The post-Enlightenment modern state is based on the divorce or separation of morality, revelation, and the reason. That is why a state cannot be Islamic. The Sharia is completely incompatible with the modern state. It is thus an axiomatic truth that if there is a Sharia, then there can be no state, and conversely, if there is a state, there can be no Sharia. The Sharia is based on a unity of moral and legal forces, whereas the state is predicated on the separation of the two. The state considers reason to be the foundation of the law and not some divine revelation or morality. In fact, the two paradigms of governance, called the state governance and the Sharia governance, are mutually exclusive and may perhaps be even totally antagonistic toward each other. Thus, when the Muslim nations claim that they have an Islamic nation or an Islamic state, they visibly sit quite uncomfortably in the world. This can be seen dramatically in the rise of the Islamic Republic of Iran. The state of Iran has completely disfigured the norms and governing principles of the Sharia to suit their political objectives. The result is that both projects of Islamic governance and the modern state have been total and abject failures. One can clearly see similar political experiments occurring in the rest of the Muslim world with similar abysmal failures. The Muslim states are unable to successfully meet any of their serious challenges. The Muslim claim that they derived and sourced their laws from the Sharia is quite absurd, and one can see that it is a case of political and institutional manipulation and exploitation. As a result, one can see that the Muslim world experiencing massive political and legal failures in their governance. But the Muslims were the most successful civilization for over 1200 years. In order to determine how and why this grand Muslim civilization flourished, one will need to look at how this civilization governed itself. If the existence of the modern Muslim state is a contradiction in terms, then how can one classify the existence of a grand Muslim civilization of the past? To understand this, one must remember that the concept of the state is a very new concept and was born only recently during the Enlightenment period, because the genealogy of the state concept is of the modern European origin. Any Muslim governance of the past, by definition, cannot be construed as a state. The entire book that Hallaq has written is just a massive elaboration on this fundamental, pivotal point and seeks to substantiate this claim. The Muslims of the world today are living in a world which is not of their own making. The Muslim struggles that encompass political and governance problems, legal issues, economic issues, and cultural problems all can trace back their roots from the fact that the world of today is based on a criteria not of their own making. The world of today was devised by the West, which can be defined as the Euro-American world order. The Muslim world exists in an age which is dictated by the rules not of their own making, but the rules composed by an alien Western civilization. The Western Enlightenment also includes the industrial and technological revolutions, modern science, nationalism, capitalism, and the American-French constitutional traditions. The Western world has emerged organically from the sources of knowledge which are rooted in the Enlightenment. The Enlightenment period from 1650 CE to 1950 CE is the era when the West emerged as the dominant power in the world. The Enlightenment age discarded religion and morality as the sources of law and governance. The secular doctrine, which sought to divorce religion from law and governance, is the cornerstone or the hallmark of this Western Enlightenment philosophy. The basic rule of Enlightenment was that henceforth only reason and inquiry will be the basis and foundations on which the society will be built. The great ideas of liberty, equality, progress, and individual rights all trace back their evolution and conception from this intellectual movement of the Enlightenment. This Enlightenment emphasized reason over superstition and science over blind faith. The emergence of the state concept is also a product of Enlightenment, as is the subsequent project of the wanton colonial exploitation of the world. This modernity and Enlightenment have been instrumental in the massive subjugation of the world and the majority of the peoples of this world. Capitalism and industrialism of this modern West has resulted in the massive destruction of the natural habitats and the environment. The destruction of the world is not due to nature, but due to the so-called doctrine of progress, one of the key concepts of modernity and Enlightenment. Other negative impacts of modernity has been the breakdown of the family and community structures of the society. The modern society has tended to create a narcissistic individual, resulting in the fragmentation of the family units and inculcating other forms of mental illnesses. The West and its modernity have been instrumental in creating these massive failures in terms of human suffering and environmental disasters, which can only be classified as projects of destruction. Therefore, one must evaluate them and this project of destruction on some sound basis and principles. One sound way to evaluate this project of destruction is on the basis of moral and ethical principles. Human beings are moral beings, and thus moral accountability should be the only criteria on which this project of destruction of the West should be evaluated with. It is this neglect of morality by the West which is at the core of this modern project that is responsible for deplorable conditions prevailing in this world today. And the modern European state model is at the forefront of this project of destruction by the West. In contrast, the pre-modern world of Islam was primarily constructed and constituted on the basis of morality and legality. The fundamental paradigm of the Islamic world was morality. The Islamic tradition, based primarily on the Sharia law, is a rich tradition and can provide the fundamental basis for the retrieval of the lost values of moral principles which the West has abandoned. The Islamic model is a very rich reservoir of theoretical, philosophical, sociological, anthropological, legal, political, and economic information. Thus, the paradigmatic way of living under the Islamic governance system was dramatically different from the paradigmatic way of living under the present modern Western system, which is primarily based on the concept of the state. What is a paradigm? According to the philosopher Carl Schmitt, a paradigm can be construed as a central domain. If a domain becomes central, then all other problems are considered secondary and are solved on the basis of the central domain. An example of a central domain is the European idea of progress. The idea of progress is the paradigmatic central domain because all other issues of morality, politics, social, and economic situations were to be solved with the criterion of progress in mind. Whereas in the world of religion, central domain is moral upbringing, moral education, and ethical development. Whereas in the age of enlightenment, which is another central domain, the idea of progress is what really counts is economic and technical progress. Moral and other social issues are considered superfluous or redundant. The Islamic governance was a central domain of the pre-modern times, and the defining symbol of this paradigm is the Sharia. The defining characteristic of the Sharia is that it was constituted by a moral law. Thus, the Western world, if it wishes, can definitely rely on the Sharia as a moral resource for its own benefit and betterment. In the Sharia, the laws are derived on the basis of the moral. The Sharia was the central domain, and all problems and issues were solved on the basis of the moral code. The Muslim education system was conceived and prioritized on the basis of the Sharia. Many fields of knowledge such as logic, rhetoric, linguistics, dialectics were all developed on the basis of the Sharia. Even the modern sciences such as mathematics and astronomy, which became the foundations for the European Enlightenment, were developed because of the stimulus provided by the Sharia. In economics, it was the Sharia ethics that regulated the rules for profit and commerce. In education, irrespective of the field in which a scholar specialized, the basic undergraduate education was primarily based on the ethical considerations of the Sharia, and the Sharia was the supreme sovereignty in the political Islamic governance model. However, like any other paradigm, Sharia system was not ideal, but it was responsible for providing abundantly successful solutions to the diverse, complex, and multifaceted problems that the Islamic governance faced. The entire system rested on the concept of jihad, which means constant striving to attain a moral objective. Just as the Western world draws its impulse and inspiration from the ideas of the Renaissance, Enlightenment, and liberal thought, Muslims of the world wish to draw their strength and ideas based on their lost heritage of the Sharia. This is not to say that the Muslims wish to go back to the old model of Islamic governance. What this means is that the Muslims want to draw their inspiration from the very successful Muslim model of Islamic governance based on the Sharia. As mentioned before, the Islamic model may also provide solutions for the modern Western project of progress, which has evidently failed quite miserably. This is simply because the Islamic model is vastly superior to anything that the West can or has been able to offer the world. Sharia no longer exists today. Sharia practices, its education, legal codes, its sociology, an entire range of knowledge have ceased to function. However, much of the Sharia knowledge has survived, and this latent moral resource can be used for the revival and renaissance of the Islamic countries. Even though much of the Muslim law has been replaced by the Western law, the pillars of Islam and their overpowering effects have not been eliminated. The historical information can be retrieved for the benefit of moral development for both the Muslim world and also the Western world. The state is based on the European modernity since the time of the Enlightenment period. Hallaq now discusses what constitutes the modern state. A state is defined by different people in different ways. Many Western philosophers have defined the state in their own unique way. It is not an exaggeration to state that there are as many opinions about the state as there are different scholars writing about the state. At this historical juncture, one can define a state as possessing 5 form properties without which a state cannot be properly conceived. The 5 properties of the state are: number 1, a state has a constitution, which is a function of its history. 2, a state is a sovereign entity. Number 3, a state has a legislative monopoly and also a monopoly over legitimate violence. Number 4, a state has a rational bureaucratic machinery. Number 5, a state imposes a cultural hegemonic impact around it and also produces a national subject. Now let us look a little deeper in these form properties that we have identified as composing a state. Number 1, a state has a constitution, which is a function of its history. The concept of the state is a purely European creation. The modern state concept was conceived by no other people of the world other than the Europeans. The state is a unique combination of political and cultural arrangements that is of purely European origin. The concept of the state came about during the European Enlightenment. It should be made crystal clear that although Enlightenment is of European origin, but what really brought about this European Enlightenment were the massive contributions of Muslim knowledge and Muslim sciences. The Enlightenment provided the ideological and political basis for the modern European state. Number 2, a state is a sovereign entity. A state is an abstract concept and is impersonal in character. A state's legitimacy and its sovereignty is built on the fiction that it is the sole representative of the will of its citizens. The state's sovereignty is built on the foundation that the nation which forms the state is the only legitimate author of its own will and destiny. This idea is of a purely European origin. Examples of states expressing their sovereignty are the French and American revolutions that were revolutions against tyranny. Even if dictators come to the helm of the state, the concept of the state sovereignty is still maintained. The state sovereignty means that states recognize each other's authority within their respective borders. Each state is considered to represent their own nation when dealing with other states, even if unrepresentative regimes are considered to represent their respective citizens and nations. A state, in order to come into existence, needs another imagined entity called the nation, and this nation-state is imagined to be the sovereign that creates the laws and constitutions which all citizens living underneath it must be subservient to. European philosophers, the likes of the German Carl Schmitt, have noted that all concepts of the modern European state theory are really based on secularized theological concepts borrowed from the church. For example, the omnipotent God was secularized and converted into an omnipotent lawgiver, which is the nation state. It can be seen now that a nation state exists for no other reason but for itself alone, and this nation state, in order to exist, will sacrifice everything, including the sacrifice of its subjects and citizens, to assure its own survival. To be a citizen, therefore, means to live under a sovereign which has the powers of life and death, just similar to God. The state can demand the sacrifice of its citizens as and when it sees fit, as in a war. This attribute of the state being equivalent to God is sufficient alone for Islamic governance to reject the concept of the state from the very outset. Number 3, a state has a legislative monopoly and also a monopoly over legitimate violence. It is axiomatic that a sovereign nation-state will constitute itself under the law. The law is an expression of the sovereignty's will. If sovereignty constitutes one major pillar of the state, the other major pillar is the capacity to produce its own laws. A state cannot be construed as a state without its own laws. If another foreign country imposes its own laws on a subject country, then that subject state is no longer a sovereign state. Thus, a state is like a god, which gives and generates laws as an expression of its sovereignty. The state also reserves the exclusive right to use violence when it sees fit. Both the internal and external enemies are legitimate targets of the state to impose its sovereign legal will. Number 4, a state has a rational bureaucratic machinery. History of the past couple of centuries tells us that countries can be dramatically changed by revolutions and regime changes, but bureaucracy is one constant that remains the same. In fact, both the bureaucracy and administration have become even more stronger and have become a much stronger pillar of the state. With time, bureaucracy has become much more complex and pervasive and raises profound constitutional questions about the state. The different departmental bureaucracies protecting their respective domains also raises serious questions about the separation of powers as envisaged between the legislative, judicial, and executive branches of government. The bureaucracy is the top tool of administration in the modern state and is the prime organization of control, governing, and state violence. Number 5, a state imposes cultural hegemonic impact around it and also produces a national subject. The strength of any state does not depend only in its ability to organize as a society, but also to the state's ability to impact culturally to the world around it. If we agree that a state constitutes a sovereign will, then a state cannot have any other autonomous entities within the state. That is why European countries destroyed all such autonomous entities within their countries. Furthermore, administration has emerged as a powerful force in the government and almost constitutes a fourth branch of government, and this can clearly be seen to undermine the rule of law. The role of party politics also undermines the Madisonian concept of the separation of powers. In the United States, the president's party controls both the House and the Senate, which adds to the problem of separation of powers. In most countries of the world, we see that legislative branch is not the only institution that creates the general norms. In the United States, we see the presidency tends to assume despotic and arbitrary exploitative executive powers. In most liberal democracies, the executive branch very often performs the functions of the judiciary. This is because public administration is based on administrative law, which is as stringent as civil and criminal laws. The laws that the judiciary and executive produce are termed as regulations or ordinances, but in reality these laws are not their jurisdiction and these impinge on the legislative authority. The competence of the courts to review such legislation is another encroachment on this theory of separation of powers. Thus, in actual practice, this concept and theory of separation of powers have major loopholes and profound flaws. In addition, the concept of rule of law and its associated claim for democracy is also in question because the executive merges with the judiciary to legislate the general norms. So what is the paradigm of Islamic governance? It is clear by now that the state is not a trans-historical entity. This means that the state cannot be viewed as existing since the beginning of history. The concept of state is a very modern idea. The state has only come into existence since the European Enlightenment after the 1650s. In addition, there are structural and qualitative differences between the modern state and the pre-modern Islamic governance. The Islamic governance was based on moral, legal, political, social, and metaphysical foundations that are totally different compared to that of the modern state. The concept of the Islamic governance can be viewed as being parallel to the concept of modern state. The Muslim community called the Ummah can be considered equivalent to that of the nation of the modern state. Any region of the world in which the Islamic law called the Sharia was in force was considered as an Islamic domain called Dar al-Islam. Those areas which were not under the Islamic domain were called Dar al-Harb. The Sharia, which is the Islamic law, is primarily a set of moral principles which are supported and reinforced by legal concepts. The Sharia is the defining feature of the Islamic governance, and if you do not have the Sharia, you do not have Islamic governance, which means you do not have an Islamic state. In the Islamic governance model, sovereignty does not belong to the Muslim community. The sovereignty in the Islamic system of governance belongs to God and God alone. As we have observed previously, sovereignty in the modern state belongs to the state and state alone. The Muslim community does not have decision-making power, but this power is only interpretive and based on consensus. God is the ultimate sovereign because he literally owns everything. The Caliph, the Sultan, or any other executive rule the Islamic domain at the pleasure of the Sharia and not vice versa. Since God is the ultimate owner of everything and all wealth, the care of the poor, the needy, the destitute was legislated as their right. God's sovereign will is reflected in the Sharia. The law of the Muslim God is the Sharia. The Sharia as a moral code represents the moral will of the God. Thus, there can be no Islamic state or Islamic governance without the Sharia having the ultimate authority. The Sharia is defined and constituted by conceptual, theoretical, interpretive, practical, educational, and institutional norms that we call the Islamic law. The Sharia is a huge and colossal project for building a moral legal framework for Islamic governance. The primary moral impulse of the Sharia is an attempt to discover what God really wants. It is because of these moral imperatives there can be no Islamic state or governance without the Sharia, where the sovereignty belongs to God. This is in diametric opposition to the concept of the modern state, where the supreme sovereignty belongs to the state. Here one needs to establish the constitutional capacities of the Sharia. Since Sharia represents God's will, it regulates all society either directly or through limited delegation. The rule of the Sharia is all supreme, and everybody must observe the rule of the Sharia, including the leader and all institutions, all political institutions, all economic institutions, all legal institutions, and all governing institutions are all subject and subordinate to the will of the Sharia. The Sharia is a supreme legislative power. There is no such thing as judicial review in Islam, which means the judiciary in Islam cannot contribute to any legislation. The Sharia only allowed limited legislative powers to the executive. Thus, Sharia can be understood as a bottom-up system of governance. Based on what the Sharia represented, one can say the Islamic system of governance was a democracy of the highest caliber, vastly superior to the Western conception. As we have observed, the Sharia was absolutely not the creation of Islamic rulers or the Islamic State. The Muslim community organically developed its own legal experts that constituted the Islamic legal system. The jurists of Islam came from lower and middle class backgrounds. These common folks were inspired by the teachings and egalitarianism of the Quran. These experts saw themselves as advocates of the society in which they lived. In particular, they prided themselves in giving priority to the protection and needs of the weak and the disadvantaged. The Mufti was a private legal specialist and was legally and morally responsible to the society. The ruler or executive or sultan was subservient to the Mufti. The defining duty of the Mufti was to issue an opinion on a case based on his expertise in the Sharia. This legal ruling was termed a fatwa. Consulting the Mufti was free of charge, and this means that legal counsel was widely accessible for all. The Muslim law books are composed of the systematized collections of these fatwas. Thus, Mufti was a supreme legal authority who defined what the law was in a particular situation, and his opinion or ruling is what is called the fatwa. The fatwa was an authoritative statement of the law. This fatwa was not binding, but in most situations, fatwa was able to resolve the dispute in question. In the Muslim courts, it was the fatwa that was paramount and not the decision of the judges called the qadi, as in the case in the modern Western state. This is the main reason why the doctrine of precedence is not the norm in the Muslim Sharia courts. The role of the author jurists was to write, abstract, and compile the legal works and the fatwas. These publications were used as standard reference work by the judges. The authority of the law resided in the muftis' fatwas and treatises of the author jurists. The judges accepted the authority of the muftis' opinions. Thus, the legal knowledge was free, widespread, and accessible to everyone. The muftis and other legists were willing to impart this knowledge to anyone interested in learning it. The Sharia was the law of the land, reflecting the morals of the heaven and the God of the universe. This law was pluralistic in nature and reflected various interpretations on the same set of facts according to locality, situation, culture, and different schools of law. The judge, known as the Qazi, was the only appointed and paid jurist by the ruler. This appointment was by way of delegation, as the Caliph or the ruler was himself a deputy of the Prophet. Thus the Qadi represented an extension of caliphal authority in regulating the affairs of the society. This Muslim judiciary was totally independent of the executive. Supreme sovereignty always remained with God, and the Sharia was a reflection of God's sovereignty. The duties of the Caliph or the ruler as a representative or deputy of God included: number 1, enforce and execute the Sharia court judgments; number 2, implement punishments for the Quranically prescribed laws; number 3, maintain the capacity to raise an army for defense of the frontiers; number 4, improve safety of the roads and other public infrastructure; number 5, divide booty after war; number 6, collect and redistribute the arms tax; number 7, appoint, supervise and dismiss qadis, market inspectors and officers of the mint; number 8, attend to the orphan minors, the wretched, the destitute and those who have no legal guardians. The ruler was subject to Sharia law as any other common citizen. The Caliph assumed and conducted his authority on the basis of Sharia, and the ruler could immediately be dismissed at the pleasure of the Sharia. The ruler was subservient to the law. Thus, Muslim civilization was totally based on moral accountability and was a paradigm of executive governance. The supremacy of the Sharia means that the rule of law was supreme. This also means that the Muslim law-based governance was quite superior to the Western model of governance of the present age. Therefore, it would be a pity if the Muslims adopt an inferior Western mode of governance as opposed to the brilliant governance model that is successfully accomplished over the centuries of their history. Hallaq supports his thesis by presenting 4 more arguments that make the Western state model completely antithetical, immoral, and unacceptable for Muslims. These additional arguments are based on the domains of the legal, the domain of the political, the domain of the subject or citizen formation, and the domain of economics and globalization. Now we will briefly discuss each of these domains that make the Muslim acceptance of the Western state concept rather disastrous for not only the Muslims, but also the West and the world at large. First problem, author terms as the rise of the legal, is represented in the modern Europe between the separation between the capital is and capital ought. The capital is what empirically exists, what actually is the state of affairs at the present time, what exists based on the laws that are man-made by the state that is sovereign and which is answerable to no one but itself. The capital ought is what should exist based on some higher norms and laws, based on immorality that is supreme, immorality that reflects the will of the supreme God. The author argues that the rise of the legal in the modern Western project makes them incompatible with any Islamic mode of governance because they lack even a minimum degree of any moral fabric. Western philosophy is obsessed with gaining knowledge so that it can control, exploit, and dominate the world. Human being is construed to be autonomous, and itself is the center for any moral impulse or behavior. Human beings are free and independent of any restraint except those based on reason. This freedom easily translates to desire to control and dominate. Matter is considered brute and inert, and thus any natural resources can be exploited without any moral restraint. Man can lord over the world and its resources at their own discretion, and there are no moral demands made. The moral rules are discovered by human reason alone, and are based on the considerations of the well-being of the society. Thus, the objective laws are discovered by human reason alone. The morality and ethics rests on the laws derived by human reason alone. Laws cannot and must not be based on tradition or scriptural authority. However, in Islamic world based on Quran, there was no distinction between the legal and the moral. Islam represented an inseparable unity of the legal and the moral. Thus, there could be no difference or dichotomy between what actually exists and what should exist. That is, European divergence between capital is and capital ought could, by definition, not exist in Islam. The Muslim metaphysics and cosmology is singularly grounded in moral natural laws, and this imparted deep psychological effects. In this cosmology, God had created everything in the universe for humans to enjoy, but within moral restraints. God had created the universe on the divine principles of truth and justice. Thus, humans were answerable for their actions. On the day of judgment, all human actions will be judged on the basis of divine scales of justice. The Quranic laws are moral, and humans are challenged to do good only. In Islamic law, God is the sole sovereign and not the state as in the modern West. The Quran does not constitute law in a technical sense, but the Sharia based on Quranic concepts is the actual Muslim law. The Quran exhorted mankind to do good, and this Quranic ethic is amply demonstrated in the Sharia. Thus, in the Islamic law, there could be no distinction between the legal and the moral. The distinction between the legal and the moral only arose in the modern West, and this was occasioned by Western desire for power and domination. It was the Islamic law, the Sharia law, that presented the biggest obstacle for the European colonization of the Muslim lands. It is for this precise reason the Europeans' first and paramount objective became to dismantle the Sharia law when they attempted to subjugate, colonize, and exploit the Muslim lands. Thus, it should be crystal clear that the modern Western law is based on positivism. It will be recalled that positivism is the Western philosophy or a mode of thinking that holds that the true knowledge can only be truly established based on sensory experience and objective observations. This means that all genuine knowledge can only be derived based on empirical evidence and scientific methods. Positivism rejects metaphysics' claim that cannot be proved through scientific or experimental methods. However, the Islamic law is not a positive law, but a substantive law. The substantive law is defined as the body or rules and general principles of which the law manuals of Sharia are composed of. The Islamic substantive law is a pluralistic in nature and based on individualism, locality, and cultural traditions, and ultimately anchored in a cosmic moral imperative. The rise of the political in the Western world is also related to the positivist doctrine that was at the root of the rise of the legal. The Western tradition has given birth to the concept of the controlling doctrine that power, earthly political power, is of the essence and is the new God. In fact, power and positivist norms became as intertwined as the political and the legal within the concept of the state. Thus, it became the central norm in the West that the final arbiter of all issues is political power alone, and there was no room for morality in this new paradigm. Politics is not only a major domain, but in fact is the central domain. It will be recalled that a central domain means that all other minor domains are subservient to it. If you solve the problems of the central domain, then by virtue of it, all of the problems of the minor domains can be solved by extension and based on it. Violence is the primary resource of the political. The defining feature of the political is the primary distinction between a friend and the enemy. Because the political domain is a central domain, it subordinates all other domains, and it assumes power to exert on issues about life and death, about peace and violence, about freedom and oppression. The political thus defines all other spheres of human action in the society. Most importantly, it defines the individual member, the subject of the state, as a citizen. No one is allowed to exist outside the definition of the citizen. The state is defined by its citizen, and the citizen is defined by the state. And the relation between the state and the citizen becomes like that of a parent and child. The nation-state is thus a cumulative conglomeration of the total citizens living within the boundaries of the state. Thus, by definition, the modern subject is a nationalized entity. The subject accepts the nation as representing his own self and accepts the political as a way of life. The citizen accepts the nation as a sovereign. The state as a sovereign entity means it has the power of life and death over its citizens, and when necessary, the state demands the ultimate sacrifice of the citizen when it asks the citizen on one pretext or another to go to war to preserve the sovereign, to uphold the state. This readiness of the citizen to sacrifice for the state is taken for granted by the state. Thus, the state arrogates to itself the power over life and death over its citizens. Thus, it is impossible for the Muslims to live in a nation-state that is erected on the basis of the doctrine of positivism. The modern state is based on unethical and immoral grounds. The state as immoral, or best as an amoral entity, can in no way make its citizens as good, which is one of the proclaimed objectives of the state. In Islamic governance, there was no concept of conscription. Islamic governance did not ask the individual for any self-sacrifice. In fact, the Islamic governance did not even ask for the sacrifice of the individual, even in the name of God. In Islam, the military service was mostly performed by slave soldiers. These soldiers were paid and trained by the chief executive and mostly lived apart from the local populations. Even their lifestyles and languages were sometimes different than the areas they defended. The general population was only solicited for war aims through the sanction of the Sharia under the concept of jihad. While jihad was considered an important obligation, but it did not override other important considerations. For instance, debtors could not join the jihad. Men wishing to join the war campaign had to obtain permission from their parents. Fighting the non-Muslims was not ordained in the Sharia, but for rebuffing and defeating the enemy for the everlasting glory of God. Thus, jihad was not a state law but a morally anchored response. Jihad was mostly voluntary and subject only to one's moral conscience. Unlike the modern West, there was no punishment for refusal to join the war effort. Refusing to join the war effort only entailed losing God's grace in the hereafter. Thus, The self-sacrifice in the Islamic governance was just a moral duty based only on self-defense and was largely a matter of individual choice. This means the focus of the Sharia was improving the moral capacity of the society and not about power politics. The third major area, or the third major domain, where the paradigm of Islam and the paradigm of the West are mutually exclusive and in fact antithetical to each other, is the formation of the individual human subject. Every human society tries to establish some type of social organization in order to establish order and discipline. In the pre-modern societies, the social organization of the society was mainly autonomous, self-regulated, self-ruled, and with very minimal bureaucracy, whose main purpose was to collect taxes. Since modern state is a uniquely Western contribution after the period of modernity, then the subject that it produced, namely the citizen, is also a uniquely Western concept. The European rise of the monarchies was directly related to the desire of the rulers to control the populations living under their domains so that the monarchs could enrich themselves. These monarchs also promoted colonizing ventures abroad to accumulate additional wealth abroad. The massive rape of the colonies abroad accumulated tremendous wealth from abroad that ultimately sponsored and financed the Industrial Revolution in Europe. In order to control the unruly European populations, the monarchs ventured to establish institutions of control and subservience in their societies. These institutions included the creation of the police force for the purposes of surveillance and control. In order to reinforce the police apparatus and their objectives, prison systems were organized and established. But in order to fully control the populations, something else was needed, and that was education. Thus, vast school and university systems were established that inculcated discipline and good conduct. Education was also deemed essential to produce the citizens who would work and be productive. Education was deemed as a utilitarian device in order to make a subject who was tame, docile, disciplined, and economically productive. Fearing that poverty could lead to revolutions and depositions of the monarchs, welfare systems were established to provide some minimum safety nets, and hospitals were established to prevent disease and improve the health. The primary aims of the emergence of schools, armies, hospitals, and prison systems in Europe was to create individuals and subjects who were subservient, docile, and materially self-sufficient and productive. The state defined these controlled subjects as a national citizen of the state. Western governments, very often taking the help of the academia and universities, started portraying themselves as problem-solving machines. This attribute of the state being a problem-solving institution is a hallmark of the modern Western state. The state, to justify its existence, even tends to create problems where they do not necessarily exist. The state meddles into the family affairs, population affairs, economic affairs, poverty issues, and environmental issues. A nation thus becomes a conglomeration of the total sum of all the individual citizen subjects residing within its borders, and nationalism becomes a defining characteristic and creed of the citizen subjects. In this world of states, it is impossible to live outside the concept of national citizens. Discipline, efficiency, and work become the primary criteria on which the worth of the citizen is evaluated with. The premium of life is now judged on the basis of external factors rather than the internal ones. But the price that the modern West has paid in this political theory of nationalism is to create individuals who are deeply, emotionally, and spiritually disenchanted. The individuals feel a deep sense of loss, the loss of the sacred, and a loss of a state of wholeness. The modern subject is isolated, fragmented, and has lost a sense of identity. The modern society has created individuals who are self-centered, narcissistic, or impersonal. Because of these traits, the Western societies have produced regressive ideologies such as nationalism, fascism, and Nazism. The Zionist ideology, currently indulging in the genocide in the Middle East, is just their latest manifestation. Compared to the modern West and its nation-state concepts, the Muslim societies lived in a more egalitarian and merciful system and under a rule of law which the modernity cannot even match by a long shot. The Muslim rulers did establish institutions of higher learning called the madrasas, but these schools were not under the direct control of the rulers. The rulers could not control the curriculum in the schools, they could not control what was taught and how it was taught. The subjects that were taught in these schools were essential for the law and for satisfying the needs of the society, leading to the good life. Generally, the subjects taught were language, grammar, syntax, Quran studies, prophetic traditions, law, mathematics, medicine, chemistry, logic, rhetoric, and dialectics. Thus, the main objective of the Muslim education was to inculcate education and skills that were useful within the social order of the Muslim societies. The Muslim education was absolutely not designed to enhance the power of any ruler or any ruling elite. Thus, the Islamic governance produced subjects and were educated under the confines and umbrella of the Sharia. As noted before, the Sharia was an expression of God's sovereignty on earth, and the Muslim subject was formed under the direct observations and guidance of the Sharia ethic. The Sharia-based Muslim subject was therefore completely different than the subject formed by the modern state. The objective of the Sharia was to create a good society in this world and create a path to individual salvation both in this world and the eternal world to come. The Sharia by design was a synthesis of the moral and the legal. The Europeans erroneously evaluate the Sharia as having failed because it did not distinguish between the moral and the legal. This European indictment is based on the grounds of both deficiency and inefficiency and only reflects the ideological foundations of the modern European state concept. The European repugnance for the religious in the legal sphere amounted to a complete rejection of the possibility of the moral within the legal sphere. But the Sharia Muslim law laid immense emphasis on the moral in the organization and development of the Muslim society and its education. The Sharia could not exist without its moral bearings. Islamic Sharia law foundations and the formation of the Muslim subjects were built on 5 foundational pillars of Islam. These are: number 1, Shahadatain, the double testimony that there is no God but God and that Muhammad is the messenger of God. Number 2, Salat, performance of the prayers. Number 3, Zakat, payments of the alms tax. Number 4, Hajj, performance of the pilgrimage to Mecca. Number 5, Saum, fasting in the month of Ramadan. The Sharia law had major portion of its chapters on the moral and ritualistic teachings. Thus, the major portion of the Muslim law and religious works focused on the development of moral and good individuals. The Sharia criminal law amounted to just a small portion of the overall law. Thus, Sharia law cannot be understood without understanding its moral basis. The primary objective of the Sharia was to produce subjects who were morally good, and to be morally good meant to make the people near to God. The 5 daily prayers for the entire duration of lifetime exceeds in importance any of the other 4 obligations of double testimony, pilgrimage, fasting, and alms tax. The prayers focused on the bodily and the spiritual sphere, but other obligations such as the alms tax, pilgrimage, and fasting addressed the believer's material, social, and psychological universe. The 4th major domain, where the paradigm of Islam and the paradigm of the West are mutually exclusive and in fact antithetical to each other, is in the sphere of economics and finance, conceptions of international corporations, and free market globalization. Let us first conceptualize what an Islamic governance would mean should it by some miracle come into being, and what it would really mean in actual practice. A truly Islamic governance would mean, number 1, the establishment of a divine sovereignty. Number 2, a robust separation of powers between the legislative, judicial, and executive branches of government. Number 3, the executive power is only exercised to implement the legislative norms. Number 4, morally based legal norms, which is the Sharia, is put in the service of the community. Number 5, educational institutions are fully independent of the executive. Number 6, the educational system is geared to produce good and moral persons. Number 7, the educational system emphasizes the learning and discovering as part of developing individuals for a morally good life and to discover God, not as an instrument for power or hegemony or exploitation. But 8, the human subject is developed to its full potential so that the member is a fully integrated, successful, and harmonious moral member of the community. Number 9, the Islamic governance does not require the individual member of its society to pay the ultimate sacrifice for itself. Number 10, the individual members of the Muslim community develop their capacities and take care of themselves as an extension of a morally imbued universe. Let us assume that such an Islamic governance comes into existence. First, such an Islamic governance will need recognition from the rest of the world, which is composed of nation states. Then, the second hurdle that such an Islamic state will have is how to negotiate in the realm of globalization. This globalization is a new form of power dynamics and power relationships between and amongst the states. This globalization is not just an economic phenomenon, but it extensively impacts on the political and cultural spheres as well. In addition, this phenomenon of globalization is supported and sustained by modern technologies of telecommunications. Thus, these modern technologies have deeply penetrated and asserted their dominance across state boundaries and have rendered the boundaries more or less irrelevant. And globalization is mainly a capitalist project, a project of the rich and powerful states. The ultimate objective of globalization is the creation of a single unified world market operating under a single set of legal norms. At this stage, it is very difficult to interpret what globalization really means. Some people interpret globalization to mean that the state is progressively losing its autonomy, power, and centralizing capacity. A second thesis suggests that the state remains a potent political actor in the age of globalization. The state continues to resist the impact of globalization, and it continues to define the concepts of citizenship and territoriality. The state, under this interpretation, remains indispensable. Therefore, there are three possible futures in the age of globalization. First, there could be a total victory of globalization. Second, there can be a total victory of the state. Third, there can be some common understanding and ability to exist between the globalized economy and the state. In the foreseeable future, it looks like the third scenario will probably continue to operate, which is the present reality on the ground. However, as you have noted in this study, the Islamic governance is completely incompatible with the modern state. If the Islamic governance is diametrically opposed to the modern state concept, it is even less compatible with the modern globalization. The new telecommunication technologies have strongly penetrated the cultural forms which were previously the exclusive domain of the states. An example is the presence of McDonald's and Walmarts all across the globe. This cultural hegemony is aided and assisted with political and military penetration and hegemonic practices. The economic aspects of globalization is reflected in the priorities of the European Union, ASEAN, NAFTA, WTO, IMF, World Bank, and others. The sheer size of the financial global markets is immense, and these predominantly privilege the liberal capitalist states. The states that benefit the most from globalization are the United States, Europe, Japan, and China. In all of this globalization, the state-created and state-regulated corporation plays the central role. The purpose of the corporation is to increase its wealth. The corporation pursues this profit-making and wealth-increasing objective above all other objectives such as social responsibility or environmental protection or health and egalitarian aspects. In fact, the corporation has become notorious for its inhumane and exploitative practices. The corporations destroy the lives of people through sweatshop practices, oil spillages, low wages, and callous industrial practices. But how will an Islamic governance navigate and thrive in the current world of states and globalization? It should be clear that isolation of the Islamic governance is not an option. Islamic governance will have to deal with both the nation states and globalized world economy. The liberal economics that dominates the world today operates on a certain set of norms and principles. So does the Islamic governance. The Western liberal economy is characterized by free trade, free movement of capital, privatization, and the key objective to maximize profit and accumulation of capital. The Islamic paradigm of economy rests on the principles of moral economy. The Islamic principles of economy are based on the guidance of the Quran. These economic ideas were further enhanced and elaborated by the prophetic narratives and traditions. Finally, the Sharia consolidated, finalized, and brought the principles into normative and institutionalized final form. The success of the Sharia's economic norms can be gauged and measured from the fact that Islamic economy was amongst the most vibrant and prominent in the pre-modern world. Islamic domains were the richest and most developed regions of the world. Education, arts, science, and technology flourished in the Muslim world. Modern architecture, schools, hospitals, and mosques were everywhere. Science was respected and learning was highly prized. People read books and wrote books. No one was uneducated. Science and technology were used for the betterment of the community. Muslims made immense contributions in the areas of medicine, arts, architecture, astronomy, chemistry, mathematics, optics, navigation, to name just a few. The Islamic economic system was immensely robust and was based fully on the guidelines and norms of the Sharia. This Islamic economic system was the primary reason that European colonial domination met severe impediments in their colonial hegemonic enterprise, and that is why the colonial countries insisted on dismantling and uprooting the Sharia first, before they could consolidate their economic grasp over the Muslim lands. And this shows quite dramatically that the Muslim Sharia-based economic system, a moral economic system, is vehemently and diametrically opposed to the modernity's capitalism and its economic norms. Sharia's moral economic system was primarily based on 5 universal values called the Kulliyat. The first and most important of the 5 universals was the protection and promotion of private property and wealth. The other 4 universals were life, religion, mind, and community. Protection of life, called nafs, included laws of homicide and protection from grievous bodily injury. Protection of religion, called deen, was promoted through the adherence to the 5 pillars of Islam. These pillars represent the Muslim version of the technologies of the self. These included the concept of struggle, called jihad, and apostasy, called rida, to defend the Muslim community from external threats. The protection of the mind or rational faculty, called aql, was promoted through prayer, pilgrimage, and the prohibition to consume alcohol or other inebriants. The preservation of the community, called nasl, was achieved through laws regulating marriage, socio-economic ties, divorce, illicit sexual relationships, inheritance, custody, etc. These universals were consensually accepted in the community and inductively developed in the Sharia, utilizing the full range of legal culture. For over 500 years of practice, these universals were continually elaborated, refined, and consolidated and became the paradigmatic feature of the Sharia. In the economic sphere, Islam promoted the acquiring of wealth and the accumulation of capital. The Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, was himself a business manager, having married a powerful business merchant, and Quran itself declares all business and commercial activities as legitimate. In addition, all contractual activities are considered as moral duties under the Sharia norms. The prophetic tradition asserts, quote, God will have mercy upon a man who is magnanimous in his selling, buying, and settling debts, unquote. Another prophetic tradition states, quote, honest and truthful merchant accompanies the prophets to paradise, whereas those merchants who are dishonest and cheat will surely face the fire of hell. Charging usury was considered a major economic malpractice and corruption. Hoarding and accumulating wealth for no other reason than greed was considered a major malpractice. Earning a living to sustain the self and the family was considered a moral duty. Since God ultimately owns all wealth and everything in between, poor are seen to have a moral right to obtain a part of that wealth. The Quran explicitly ordains this right of the needy and the destitute. Further, the Sharia accepted that in acquiring wealth, no creature of God, big or small, may be harmed. Thus, in a globalized state-based Western economic system, any potential Islamic governance will face Western opposition. The 3 major challenges that any Islamic governance will face are Western militarism, external and foreign cultural penetration, and a massive liberal capitalist world market. As long as the balance of power in the world is tilted towards the West, Islamic governance will face an existential threat. The cultural penetration is harder to discern, but is more insidious form of control. These cultural forms can be in the guise of performing arts, dietary habits, commercially manipulated sexual forms, subliminal and false advertising. Islamic governance will have to take a resolute stance to curtail these types of cultural control tactics. And finally, there is the crucial economic challenge of the West. If an Islamic governance is to pursue its economic goals, it will have to address the global markets, which is driven by powerful capitalist states and their corporations. One question that is often discussed is why did Islam did not develop the cooperation? People interpret this as a weakness of the Sharia. However, it does not dawn on the critics that it was precisely the Sharia's moral bent that precluded the emergence of the cooperation. Sharia could not accept the cooperation as the concept of the cooperation was in direct opposition to its moral principles. This is because the Sharia upholds the concept of moral accountability of only the identifiable individuals. Thus, the Islamic governance will be incompatible with the modern capitalism and its ubiquitous cooperation. The Western economic model also opposes placing any shackles of social or economic justice in the pursuit of the profit motive. The paradigmatic Islamic governance places huge priority on the issues of social justice. Thus, within the globalized world economy, Islamic governance will inevitably face huge political, social, and economic barriers from the West. The ultimate result of such Islamic governance will be that it will become non-competitive and will eventually become subservient and lose its autonomy to such Western economic institutions as the IMF and the World Bank. In summary, most Muslim countries assume that the modern state is just a neutral and useful technique for efficient governance. They assume that the state can be molded to any form they wish, like a liberal democracy, a socialist regime, or even an Islamic state. The Muslims erroneously believe they can just use the Quran and the Sharia and source some laws from them, and this will justify calling their state an Islamic state. But the state is a very recent post-Renaissance and modernity is uniquely European-American project. The modern state has its own metaphysics, its own ontology, its own cosmology, and its own epistemology. Based on these resources, the state establishes its own political, social, economic, and psychological landscape, which is in direct contradiction and in outright opposition with the Islamic morally based governance. When the Muslim countries accept the modern state as a legitimate tool of governance, they subject themselves to a governance that is totally alien to their long 1200 years of brilliant and outstanding civilization. It is because of this absolute unsuitability and alienness of the concept of modern state dynamics that the Muslim countries find themselves in ungovernable, weak, and state failure situations. As the Western states develop new techniques in their modern state governance, the Muslim countries further sink deeper in chaos. Economic globalization of the West is one recent example where the Muslim countries suffer additional issues to adjust and accept the foreign concepts. Major incompatibilities between the Western state model governance and the pre-modern Islamic governance manifests in many important ways. First, there is the anthropocentric conceptualization of the modern Western state. This philosophy is based on the concepts of positivism, which declares that religion, morality, and metaphysics are imperfect and outmoded ways to view the world, and only thing that really matters is empirical science and scientific observations. But Islam totally rejects this type of positivism, and thus the Islamic governance based on positivism is simply not acceptable or possible. Islam holds the autonomy of the moral as the highest form of legality. Second, Islam cannot accept any sovereignty other than that of God. The morality is the ultimate basis of governance, and it must rest on universal and eternal principles of truth and justice. Islam does not allow any earthly sovereignty. The Islamic law is the supreme expression of the moral authority of the God. Third, in Islamic governance, God is the supreme sovereign. Thus, all Muslim law must rest on authority of the sovereign. God's will and moral authority is reflected in the Quran and the Sharia. Islamic governance must reflect the general norms and technical rules and regulations that are firmly anchored in the higher moral principles of God. Fourth, the modern state and Islamic governance produce subjects that are profoundly different from each other. These differences between the subjects can be clearly discerned in the political, social, moral, and psychological makeup of the subjects. Thus, in Islamic governance, the doing of good and the moral is a primary objective of existence. The only purpose of mankind to exist is to do good in this world. Doing good is the ultimate core of the Quran and by extension that of Islam and of Islamic governance. The 5 foundational pillars of Islam cumulatively shape the individual to live a moral-based good life. In contrast, the subject of the modern state does not even recognize the moral imperative. The state does not believe it is any of its business to make the subjects good or moral. To do good in this Western scheme is one's own private business. The personality of the Western subject is trained and valued for political, materialistic, and efficiency-based conception of life. Fifth, the modern state endeavors to extend its global reach through economic and cultural penetration through globalization. The ultimate objective of this globalization is to maximize profits and nothing else. This is in sharp contrast with the Islamic governance model, where the moral imperative is of the highest concern. In Islamic governance, the Muslim subject does seek wealth and profit, but within the bounds of social responsibility. This is because God, being the ultimate sovereign, owns everything. Thus, everyone is deemed to have a right to a portion of God's bounty. In this scheme of profound differences between the Islamic subject and the modern Western subject, each views the other with abject disdain. Just as the modern state governance sits quite uncomfortably in Muslim countries, similarly the Euro-American states also have profound problems to reckon with. As an example, the Western world is spiritually bankrupt. The modernity produces individuals who are fragmented, hedonistic, and narcissistic. This is clearly reflected in the destruction of the community, family, and the environment. How one deals with other cultures and the natural world is the ultimate measure of man. This is in fact the most central issue and can be considered as the central domain of the moral. As was noted before, if the issues related to the central domain are addressed and solved, then all other issues related to the secondary or subsidiary domains will be automatically addressed and solved as well. In conclusion, one can state that the problems facing the Muslim world are not exclusively Islamic, but these problems are interrelated with the problems being experienced by the modern West. As was discussed before, the primary problem in the West started during the Enlightenment period, where a complete separation was made between capital is and capital ought. between fact and value, between what empirically exists and what should morally exist. This distinction resulted in the separation of value from the natural world. In this valuation, the matter was stripped of all intrinsic value, and the natural resources are viewed as inert, dead objects, to be used and manipulated at one's whim. This type of logic also resulted in the separation of reason from reasons. It should be emphasized, the reason is just a human faculty and a tool for analysis. However, the reasons are defined as major fundamental principal causes that generate thought through the faculty of reason. In the pre-Enlightenment age, reason and reasons worked harmoniously together. However, after the Enlightenment, a sharp break was made between the reason and reasons. In this Western scheme, reason was elevated to a fully autonomous status and was expected to generate reasons on its own. In practical terms, this meant that the morality in the Western conception depended on the autonomous and self-legislative reason, and the reasons were surgically excised from all rationality. This freedom and autonomy of the reason is doomed to failure, because this freedom results not only in the freedom of the individual, it also results in the freedom of man to rule over nature and over other cultures. In addition, it is the freedom from all moral obligations of living in this world without any constraints. This ethics of autonomy is the cornerstone of modern West, but Western philosophers have themselves debated that autonomy of the reason makes very little sense and should be abandoned. The harmonious synthesis of reason and reasons was the hallmark of Islamic Sharia tradition. Islam, from the very beginning, considered the Islamic community as the middle community. The Quran itself elaborated the concept of the middle community for the Muslim people. In this conception of the middle ground, human faculty of reason was considered the sole discoverer of the reasons, and the reasons were firmly anchored in a cosmic moral universe. These reasons were made evident in the Quran as the revealed word of God. The main Quranic message was humans do not own the earth. There is an absolute sovereign of the entire cosmos who owns everything. Humans have an obligation to do good works that pleases the ultimate sovereign, that humanity and morality must work together in harmony. The Almighty is omnipotent and eternal and works to implement the moral imperative. The omnipotence would lose its meaning if there was no moral imperative. The Quran, the Sharia, and the Islamic jurists all recognized this moral imperative. The norms and regulations the Sharia derived always understood the pluralistic nature of the moral guidelines based on situational differences. This involved the concept of ijtihad, the never-ending progression and reinterpretation of the norms based on actual or changing situations or conditions. Thus, this institution and concept of the ijtihad bridged the divide between reason and the moral reasons. The moral bent of the Sharia was an insurmountable obstacle for the European colonialism of the Muslim lands. It was for precisely this reason that the Europeans' first target was the decimation of the Sharia from the Muslim lands. The Europeans could not accept the Sharia because the norms and regulations of the Sharia were profoundly moral and egalitarian. While the institutions of the Sharia may have been eliminated by the Europeans in the Muslim lands, but the Sharia's moral effects and teachings have not been forgotten by the Muslims. There is no reason why the Muslims cannot recapture the moral system of Islamic governance of the past. Muslims and the Europeans would both lose should they forget that they have lost an immense intellectual treasure that was the Sharia and the Islamic governance. Keeping the central domain of the moral as a starting point, Muslims can slowly start developing and articulating ways and forms of governance consistent with the Sharia. This incremental improvement in governance in the Muslim world can eventually be translated in more robust formations. This will require considerable amount of imagination and non-conformist thinking for the initiators of these new Muslim forms of governance. Muslims do not have to reinvent the wheel, as vast amounts of historical and moral resources already exist to be used as blueprints for the future. Muslims will need to again articulate and conceptualize the meaning of economics, education, private and public domains, and most important of all, protection of the environment and the natural world. Concepts of individual rights and communal rights will need to be articulated and protected. Muslims will need to learn from the failures of the West and provide solutions for those failures. Whatever future course of action that the Muslims embark upon, one thing is certain, that the central domain of the moral will be the ultimate basis for the Muslim revival. The Western world needs to abandon the myth of the clash of civilizations. It is imperative for the Muslims to engage with the Western world to bring to fruition the re-emergence of the moral as a central domain in the world, because the very survival of humanity and civilization depends on it. There is another hopeful sign. The Western postmodern philosophers themselves are starting to see the errors of modernity and seeking solutions in the moral. Thus, there is a clear chance both the Western philosophers and their Eastern counterparts can transcend their differences and work together to save the world. This moral reawakening of the West is crucial for saving the world. Islam and its moral teachings have the capacity and intellectual capital to save both the Muslim civilization from itself and the Euro-American civilization from modernity. In short, Islam provides the only solution to save the world from destruction and annihilation. Inshallah, until the next episode of the Book Review Now, this is your host, Jamshed Namdar Khan. Salam.